We've seen the executive branch be more and more aggressive about controlling the appropriations process, rescinding money that Congress has appropriated, not funding programs that Congress has actually approved. It's hard to see how you can reach a deal with this administration without some better assurance that they will actually adhere to it. And what's really surprising is the failure of the majority in the House and the Senate to stick up for congressional prerogatives. They have, over the last 6 months, just given up and given up and given up. And I think the concern is this a temporary sacrifice of congressional authority, or will this become more permanent and a new norm?
Hello, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Scott Schaefer, Senior Politics Editor at KQED, co-host of Political Breakdown. Thank you. When it comes to issues like national security, immigration policy, and higher education, Janet Napolitano speaks from decades of experience at the highest levels of government and academia. As U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, the first woman in that role, she led efforts to prevent terrorist attacks and enhance border security while spearheading the creation of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Initiative, or DACA. She was also the 21st governor of Arizona, and before that, its attorney general, and served as president of the University of California from 2013 to 2020. So we've got a lot, yes. We have a lot to cover with her. It's daily and hourly. It seems like the news changes, from immigration crackdowns to the shutdown and everything else. So please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Janet Napolitano.
Thank you.
All right, Secretary Napolitano, welcome. Let's talk about what's happening right in front of us, which is the potential for a government shutdown at midnight tonight. It looks like the two sides are very far apart. From the experience you've had in the federal government, Homeland Security, et cetera, what is it that concerns you about this potential shutdown?
Well, shutdowns are tough, and no one should want a shutdown. They stop federal services in a lot of different ways, and at first most folks won't notice because things like your Social Security checks, things like TSA workers at the airport and what have you, those will continue, although the workers are not getting paid during a shutdown, which is a hardship for them because many federal workers are paycheck to paycheck.
They will get paid retroactively, presumably.
Well, Congress has to pass a bill to pay them retroactively. But over time, as things accrete, there will be more and more that become obvious to the American people. And you don't just shut down like a light switch. These big federal agencies have been preparing now as the deadline has become closer and closer. You've got to alert employees. You've got to figure out who's an accepted employee, who's not barred from working versus those who are barred from working. And when I say barred from working, they can't come to the office, they can't turn on their computer, they can't open a piece of mail, they can't do a phone call, they can't do anything during a shutdown. So things really become paralyzed. And so this is now a struggle. And it's a struggle one would wish that could have been avoided. But in a way, with this Congress and this president, it doesn't surprise me that we're in this position.
Chuck Schumer, the leader, the minority leader in the Senate, of course, got a lot of criticism last time for giving enough Democratic votes last time to keep the government open. So there's a lot of pressure on him not to do that this time. What do you think? I mean, there is this concern, and Trump is promising or threatening to lay off thousands of federal workers. I mean, as you said, nobody wants a shutdown. The Democrats could avoid it if they wanted to. Politically, though, it seems like they can't really do that.
Yeah, and I think the circumstances have changed since March. We've seen the executive branch be more and more aggressive about controlling the appropriations process, rescinding money that Congress has appropriated, not funding programs that Congress has actually approved. It's hard to see how you can reach a deal with this administration without some better assurance that they will actually adhere to it. And what's really surprising, well, maybe not too surprising, but disappointing, is the failure of the majority in the House and the Senate to stick up for congressional prerogatives. They have, over the last 6 months, just given up and given up and given up. And I think the concern is this a temporary sacrifice of congressional authority, or will this become more permanent and a new norm?
Well, and it seems like the Supreme Court is sort of codifying some of that.
Yeah, don't get me started on the Supreme Court.
Well, I will. We'll go into that later.
I mean, really, the whole shadow docket thing to me is so wrong, and is the court. It is supposed to be affecting the rule of law, but how are we supposed to understand how they reach their decisions as a matter of law with these one-line emergency orders? I just don't get it.
Yeah, well, and in her dissent, Elena Kagan has been very clear about that, as the other two liberals have been. But it doesn't seem to, there's, I think, a kind of a assumption that Chief Roberts cares about history and the reputation of the court and wanting to maintain sort of neutrality and not make it be less political. But I don't see that very much. Do you? I mean, I think it was most evident with that immunity ruling. Well,
the immunity ruling opened the floodgates as far as President Trump is concerned, and I think it will go down in history as one of the more misguided rulings of the court. But this business of the shadow docket, or some call it the interim docket, these are these emergency orders that go up to reverse decisions of the lower courts that have put in abeyance many of the executive orders of the Trump administration, and they just kind of reverse that. I think they've reversed it like the last 15 times in a row. And it's a totally new way of jurisprudence at the Supreme Court. Normally the Supreme Court, they take 60 or 70 cases a year. There's briefing, there's oral argument, there's time. And then toward the end of June, they begin issuing opinions, which are written opinions and well thought out, and explain how the justices reached their legal conclusion. We're getting none of that now. And so it's not shocking that people just, and seeing not only how the court is behaving, but the import of its rulings, that it's just become an arm of the executive branch. It's not acting as a body of law. It's not issuing a body of law. Yeah. I think that should concern us too.
They're undermining the lower courts, and in some cases criticizing judges, very by name. I mean, it seems like not a healthy situation in that regard.
Not at all. And making in some cases, when they do write short paragraphs or in their rulings, they haven't had the benefit of a full factual knowledge of the record, and so they say things that are just wrong and are not supported by what was found in the trial courts and the courts of appeal. So it is really an unsatisfactory state of affairs.
So earlier today, it seems like a month ago, but earlier today, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had summoned some of the top leadership of the military, admirals and generals from all over the world. They met in Virginia. President Trump addressed them, and among other things, he said that troops can use U.S. cities, and I'm quoting here, as training grounds for their operations. And he mentioned San Francisco in particular, and he said, quote, "We'll straighten them out one by one. It'll be a major part for some of the people in this room. It's a war, too. It's a war within." What comes to mind when you hear that?
It's ridiculous. First of all, it's a misuse of the military. First of all, summoning every 1-star and above general and every admiral from all over the world, from combatant commands, to come to basically a pep rally in Quantico, Virginia, to leave their duty posts at expense to the taxpayer, loss of time, to hear Secretary Hegseth, who they all outweigh by virtue of experience and actual leading men in combat and so forth, talk to them about how to make the military in a way more manly, if I can summarize. And so they got to listen to him for 45 minutes. And then the president comes on, and first of all, he's bigfooting his own Secretary of Defense, which I kind of thought was humorous. But the president's talk was rambling and almost incoherent. Now, use of the military, that's a very serious question. And one of the real problems I see with the current administration is the practice of and normalizing use of military in our cities and on our streets. This should be done very carefully, very rarely, under exceptional circumstances. But now you put them in Los Angeles, and they were not needed. They were not wanted over the objections of the governor and the mayor. That issue is being litigated, but in a one-line order, the Supreme Court said it was okay to continue while they continue litigating. He actually put active, not just National Guard, but active duty. Now, first of all, this is not a role for active duty at all, and U.S. law since 1870s has barred the military from doing anything related to domestic law enforcement. The military, if we're developing a warfighter culture, under the words of Secretary Hegseth, they need to be training for that, and they need to be looking at Russia and China and wars where we may have to be on the ground in different parts of the world. They're not designed, and it's in my view illegal and unconstitutional to view American cities as their training ground. And let's talk about the National Guard, because you throw out the National Guard like it's a nothing. The National Guard is a big deal because these are men and women who have civilian jobs, they have families, they have other careers, and they volunteer to serve as a backup to active duty military. They are under the command of a state's governor. They're used heavily in times of natural disasters and so forth. They're there to help their fellow citizens. They are not there to be adjunct immigration officers, by way of example. And I don't think they really want to be. So that, and by taking them off of their normal duties, their normal responsibilities, and shoving them into cities where they're not wanted, it confuses the mission, it interrupts their training, and it takes them away from being available for when they're needed for other serious matters.
Yeah. We're in this moment that is so bizarre in a lot of ways. Some people have compared it to the McCarthy era with the Red Scare. Some have compared it to 1968 with political violence and assassinations. Sometimes I feel like this is a civil war of sorts, where you have the president at war with states and governors like Governor Newsom. Is there any precedent for this? How do you see this moment we're in?
Well, it's a moment like we've seen sometimes in our history. For example, Abraham Lincoln, when he was elected president, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He allowed the prosecution of newspaper editors who had published editorials encouraging people not to join the army. Congress was complaining that he was acting like a king. But he said, this is only for this time because he really had a war going on. I mean, states of the Union had seceded. There were armies. They were shooting at each other.
And he was trying to preserve the Union.
what we see in President Trump is some of the same kind of language and action, but we're not in that sort of a situation. And nor should we aspire to be, because it was, there were 800,000 people killed in the Civil War. This is not where we should be. What we need, and if we had a different president, we would have a president who was trying to bridge the gap that exists between Americans, and to try to build consensus where consensus exists. We don't have that. In fact, we have the opposite.
Well, and you think of George W. Bush after 9/11, speaking out against Islamophobia, and making sure people didn't conflate the terrorists with other, people who practice Islam, and it doesn't seem to be in Trump's DNA to do that kind of.
I don't know what's in his DNA, but certainly not that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Department of Justice. You're a former Attorney General. We saw last week that finally, after years of pressure from President Trump, he found a U.S. attorney in that district in Virginia that would try to get and did get an indictment of James Comey, the former FBI director. It's not exactly clear what they think they have on him, but based on what you know, how strong is their case, and what are some of the potential fallouts from this kind of prosecution? And apparently Tish James, the AG in New York, could be next.
Yeah, so I'm not only a former state AG, but I'm a former U.S. attorney, and I know the ethos of the Department of Justice, which has been that you do not bring cases unless you have a reasonable belief that you can not only bring it to trial, but prevail at trial and sustain a conviction. It's a much higher bar than just being able to go get a grand jury indictment. And I've worked with assistant U.S. attorneys and U.S. attorneys virtually my whole career. And people historically and to our benefit have focused on that. And that has really been kind of the culture of the Department of Justice. In fact, when I was U.S. Attorney, Janet Reno was the Attorney General. And she had real tensions with President Clinton, who'd appointed her, because she went ahead and appointed a special counsel to do the Whitewater investigation, appointed a special counsel to investigate the president who had appointed her. In contrast, what we have now, unfortunately, is an attorney general who believes that she represents not the rule of law, not the Constitution, not the people of the United States, but the president as a person in the United States. And that is a distortion of the norms that have governed that office. There's a real danger here, and I don't know that people really appreciate it, but when and this U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia is not the only one. The one in Nevada was, I think, just disqualified. New Jersey, there are other U.S. attorney appointments that he's tried to sneak in, absent nomination and Senate confirmation, to run these cases. And it is part of really an insidious retribution campaign using the Department of Justice. And once one party, one side begins to use the Department of Justice that way, what's to stop another party when it's in power from doing the same thing? And, the United States around the world, one of the things people in other countries always say to me is, we like the United States because you operate under the rule of law, not the rule of retribution or persecution.
Is that now over?
I don't think we can say that now.
How hard is it to restore?
It is going to be hard, because the more these things happen, the more it becomes normalized, and people just say, well, that's just the way it is, and that's what we put up with. Well, we haven't put up with it, we shouldn't put up with it, and we should stop it.
Yeah. So much of what he's done, the president, has been through these executive orders. He's issued hundreds of them. The first time he was president, he, of course, issued executive orders, but there were certain guardrails in place, including some of the people around him who cared about the Constitution, for example, and weren't just, loyalists to him. Have you been surprised at how quickly he has been able to dismantle so many things and to break so many norms in just, the number of months that it's been since he got there?
Well, he's had 4 years to prepare. He did 4 years as a warm-up. That was his first term. Then he had 4 years to sit down there in Florida, and you had other groups beginning to think about a second Trump term. You have Project 2025, et cetera. They were preparing. And even though he disavowed Project 2025 during the campaign, when you read it and you see what's been going on, it's pretty much been a playbook. And the executive order after executive order after executive order, I forget how many he issued the day he was inaugurated, but those were all typed up and ready to sign. So he was ready. He knew what he wanted to do, and he put people around him who were going to facilitate that, as opposed to say, Mr. President, maybe we ought to think twice about this, or this could be some consequence of that. And he's flooded the zone.
One of his targets, of course, has been universities. He's gone after the Ivy League initially, Columbia, Harvard, of course. Harvard is one of the few schools that has really stood up and sued and is resisting what's happening. UCLA is now facing, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe $1 billion in federal aid that could be cut. What should universities be doing right now, given the risk that they face to alienating him even further and making an enemy of themselves?
Well, first, Scott, let me be clear. I'm not speaking for the University of California now. I'm no longer the president. I stepped down in 2020. So these are my own personal views. But here has been what has happened, and this is what gives the president such leverage, which is that after World War II, the country decided that basic research that was necessary but was so risky that the private sector was unlikely to embark on it, that would be centered in our universities, private and public. And that is where the University of California, Harvard, whatever, they have a huge now entanglement with the federal government because of the fact that they are research universities, and they have hundreds, if not thousands, of faculty and postdocs and graduate students and whatever in different types of laboratories doing all the work, which pushes the United States forward. Which is, to a large extent, responsible for why the U.S. has been the dominant economy in the world since World War II. But those dollars now can be used as leverage. And so the administration, they're just saying, look, you got to do this, and this, or we're going to take away your $600 million in federal research grants. Now, there are a lot of questions about that. Can they do that legally? What are they asking for? Should you negotiate with them at all? If you negotiate with them and reach a settlement, will they abide by that settlement? Can you trust them? It's a terrible place for universities to be, and I don't envy being a university president in these days. I think one of the, we've already talked about the devolution in the Justice Department and the rule of law, but another really serious devolution in the administration is the lack of regard for science. Science, to me, we are in an era of science, technological development, and so forth. We need the pipeline to keep being filled. We need to be able to support innovation. We need to be able to support universities. Instead, we're getting the reverse. And when we see the lack of regard for science, it's not just at the university level, it's in public health.
Well, the whole firing of the Vaccine Advisory Committee and
yeah, I mean,
canceling $500 billion in contracts for the
mRNA. I mean, yeah, I mean, and so this does not help the country either come together or to move forward, either to be more innovative, either to be smarter, either to be healthier. It just doesn't.
Yeah. A couple weeks ago, or maybe it was less than that, the president or the chancellor at UC Berkeley turned over the names of 160 students and staff who that were demanded by the Department of Justice for its investigation into anti-Semitism on campus. What do you think of that?
I'm glad I wasn't one of the names. Who knows what the administration is going to do with the names? Now, I'm sure, when you're dealing with the federal government and those kinds of requests, usually the law is you got to turn over what you got. And in the past, you were usually able to work out an agreement to redact names and so forth. I suspect that kind of negotiation was not possible with this administration. But you're caught between really what the law requires or whether you're going to take a stand and say, no, we're not going to give you those names. And then the hammer comes down.
Would you have given those names over?
I'm not answering that question.
Why? Why not?
I don't have to, and I don't want to.
Okay. There are.
I would have, honestly, I would have explored every conceivable alternative to giving over those names. I mean, I think I don't envy the chancellor or the president of UC. I think they were under very tight timelines, but it's had a real impact on not only the people whose names were given over, but on others. And realize one of the things that's happening here with these kinds of actions, but also with the picking up of international students who have expressed pro-Palestinian viewpoints and so forth, is an effort to chill speech. And I sense that is happening in places around the country. People are just staying quiet.
What are you're saying it's being felt on campus? You're at the Goldman School over at Cal. I mean, how do you feel it? I mean, is this conversations that happen in the faculty lounge or conversations with students? I mean, how is it being expressed?
Well, at the Goldman School, actually, I haven't found either the faculty or the students suppressed at all. They're in it for the right reasons. But I'm thinking about, for example, the case that was filed in federal court in Boston by a variety of international student groups, but also faculty associations around the country, talking about the chilling effect of all of these various types of actions on university faculties and students around the country. And I believe the judge in that case just issued an excoriating opinion agreeing with the plaintiffs and saying that what the administration was doing was a violation of the First Amendment. We'll see if that goes up to the Supreme Court and what they do.
I could be mistaking that case with another one, but I know one of those judges was a Reagan appointee.
He was. The Boston judge was a Reagan appointee.
Yeah. I don't know what that, what difference that makes when it gets up to the Supreme Court. One thing that apparently Berkeley did, because am I correct that those names have been handed over before? Like you said, your understanding is if they're asked for, they have to give it up. My understanding is that what's different is that they actually informed the 160 people. They let them know. I don't know why they did that, maybe just to give them a heads up. I mean, any thoughts about why they would have been?
No, I'm glad they did. But it's such an unusual circumstance because, again, like I said, from time to time we would get requests for investigative files from the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education and so forth. And particularly for non-substantiated complaints, we would ask to redact names, and the OCR would say, fine. They just wanted to see whether something was done, whether there was actually an investigation. Yeah. They weren't that concerned with a particular name. They were looking at the institution and how the institution handled it. This is a different situation.
Yeah, I think that the president, relatively new president of UC, is from Texas, right?
Yeah, he was the president of the UT system.
Yeah. Is there anything in that in terms of like his perspective? I mean, I'm sure you've talked with him. You've had a chance to get to know him a little bit. People from Texas often have a different point of view. That might have been one of the reasons the regents chose him, knowing that Trump was going to be president. I don't know. I'm just speculating wildly.
Yeah, no, President Milliken, he was president of the UT system, but before then he was president of the CUNY system in New York. Before then, I think he was in North Carolina. He was in Nebraska. He's a lawyer by training. He has an extensive career in higher education. And I think he was hired for that reason. He's just probably one of the top 2 or 3 people in the country in terms of administering large higher education systems. He came and he arrived in California I think 2 days before they dropped the hammer on UCLA. So it's like, well, welcome to the Golden State, and he's been dealing with this ever since.
Yeah. I want to talk about Homeland Security. You were a governor when you were chosen to be Secretary of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem was a governor of South Dakota before she was chosen to be Homeland Security Secretary. I'm wondering, when you heard that she was going to be heading up the agency that you once did, you thought what?
Well, I thought the dogs in South Dakota were now safer. Okay, that was a little tacky. I thought, well, maybe she can do it. South Dakota's it's a small state. It's not a border state. But I'd been a former governor, but of a much larger border state, Tom Ridge, of course, had been the governor of Pennsylvania before he became secretary. So being a governor is not out of line with being the Secretary of Homeland Security. The question is the depth and breadth of that experience and what you bring to the role. Nobody is a master of everything that DHS covers. I mean, it's such a broad, has such a broad remit that there's going to be, by definition, learning on the job. And we can all have our opinion on how she has learned.
Yeah. One of the things that happened in the past week is that the FBI dropped its investigation of Tom Homan, who had been caught accepting a bag of $50,000 cash. Undercover agent. This is obviously before Trump became president. What does that tell you that the borders are, with so much authority and control over ICE and everything we're seeing with deportations, seems to be absolved of criminal activity?
Yeah, I can't. First of all, we don't know all the facts, and so let's just be clear. But it was not a good look, and but I think the more serious question is not just did Tom Homan take a $50,000 bribe. He wasn't in office when he took the cash, so I don't think technically it was a bribe. So that's there are legal issues there, whether what he did was actually technically breaking the law. The more serious question is how the administration is carrying out its immigration agenda. And is it doing so in a way that the American people thought that they were voting for when they voted for President Trump? Immigration was clearly a leitmotif of the campaign. And the Biden administration was criticized heavily on immigration. And I have to say, in all honesty, for some good reason, they'd lost control of that border. And you cannot do immigration policy and lose control of the border. I will say that some of the things the administration has done on the border, to me, make sense. Borders are important. They're part of a nation's sovereignty. And if people don't see a secure border, then the domino effects of that in other ways become really severe. So I think there's actually a pretty broad consensus that the southern border is now more secure, better secured, and that's a good thing. What the controversy is about is what you do in the interior of the country with the 11 or 12 million or so undocumented individuals who live in the United States. Now, the administration and the campaign focused on, we're going to get the worst of the worst, those who have serious criminal convictions, et cetera. But then they started sending out quotas to ICE. You got to do 3,000 arrests a day and so forth. And it turns out that you can't do 3,000 arrests a day and limit yourself to those who've committed other crimes while in our country. When I was secretary, we prioritized those who'd committed other crimes in the country, those who we captured right at or near the border before they got into the country and settled here, and those who were known and provable, either connected with terrorism or gang activity. And and those priorities were pretty much followed by ICE and by how we did our operations. We're seeing something very different now. What we're seeing is a focus just on picking people up, arrest them, and then oppose their release pending the disposition of their case, but putting them in detention. So I think now there's 65,000 people in detention.
And those detention centers are kind of black boxes. I mean,
Yeah.
Democratic elected officials have tried to get in. The media can't get in. I mean, it's really unclear what the conditions are there, but it can't be good.
It's unclear, and the reports are not favorable. I'll put it that way. And all of this activity is going on, and then as protests have developed against some of this activity in Los Angeles and Chicago, two examples, that is then used as the pretext for sending in the National Guard, and we get right back to the misuse of the National Guard.
You, I'm sure, recall that President Obama, who you were in his administration, was called the deporter-in-chief.
Yeah.
And I believe it was here in San Francisco where that happened. He was speaking, and some activist stood up, called him that. What do you remember about that moment and the impact it had on the president, on the policy, on the politics, and so on?
So I was the secretary when he was called the deporter-in-chief, and I think much to the president's chagrin and the displeasure of some in the White House. But I just laid it out. I said, look, I've been a prosecutor. I've been a border state governor. We have got to take action along the border. We've got to move these cases. We're using these as our priorities, which I've just described. And then we need to work with the Congress on reforming and changing the immigration law per se, which still hasn't happened, which is the thing that nobody talks about these days, which is how anachronistic, overly complicated, and out of date our immigration law is. But we needed to work on that, and we worked with we actually got a fairly decent bill, not perfect, but decent bill through the Senate in 2013, and then that was never reached, was never even assigned to a committee in the House. They just dropped it, missed opportunity. And we did, of course, we did DACA.
Yeah. Was there a discussion, when Barack Obama came in, I think they had 59 or 60 votes in the Senate. Hard to believe, Democrats. Big majority in the House. Could have done immigration reform. I mean, there's a lot of things you could have done. I know they chose to do health care, obviously.
They chose to do health care.
Yeah. Was it just assumed you couldn't do both?
I think that was the operative assumption. And then health care just took much longer than anyone anticipated. And there were so many ups and downs along the way and by the time it passed, et cetera, the Democratic majorities had been lost.
Yeah. We saw.
By the way, I don't think the fact of the matter is immigration affects Republicans and Democrats. I mean, it's not just a Democratic issue. The reform of our immigration law should be done in a bipartisan way. It affects our economy. It affects our workers. It affects our values. It should reflect our values. I mean, these big issues are things where this ultra-polarization is really blocking the United States, and particularly in the Congress, from focusing on these big problems they need to focus on.
Well, we're in this, moment of a lot of political violence. We've been, it goes back years, the arson attack on the governor of Pennsylvania while he and his family were sleeping. Paul Pelosi attacked at home. The Minnesota lawmaker and her husband killed. Two others shot. Of course, Charlie Kirk shot and killed more recently. As somebody who works on a campus and has on a campus that has a tradition of free speech, but has also had its tussles, I think, with some of the right-wing speakers who have come in to talk to students. What's the takeaway? What should we learn from this moment where we're thinking about how to lower the temperature, but also allow free speech?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that at college campuses across the United States, there are literally thousands of speaking events happening every single day from different speakers of different political stripes, et cetera. And most of them go off without a hitch. And then, but the media focus on the ones, the few that have really erupted inappropriately.
Well, it's
and
hard
wrongfully.
to avoid. Hard to avoid the coverage. I mean, you can't ignore what happened, right?
You can't, yeah. But the point of the matter is, it's not put into the overall context of campuses are full of speech. I mean, that's part of why they exist. So there's that. If the question is about political violence, that's a somewhat, to me, different question. I think that this raft of violence against political figures that we've seen in the last year is to be abhorred. It is not who we are. It is not how a democracy should operate. It's not to say that we haven't had periods of this kind of violence before, as you mentioned, but we seem to be in a particular period beginning with the attempted assassinations on President Trump, then candidate Trump, the murders of the Minnesota legislator and her husband.
Well, let's not forget about January 6th.
Let's not forget about January 6th. And leading up to and including the murder of Charlie Kirk, and et cetera. So what we need to be thinking about is it right or fair to categorize these murders as part of a broad left-wing conspiracy, or are these basically lone wolves who live their lives online and have become radicalized, if I can use that word, online and are acting out in that way. And it's a much more complex question than just blaming the other side. Yeah. And blaming the other side, once again, does nothing to kind of bring the temperature down.
Yeah. Well, Trump, of course, has used it to go after Antifa, declaring them a terrorist, and not even that, I say them. They aren't. It isn't a them. It's an idea, really. There's no president. There's no assets. There's, it's just a concept, really. But they could use it. I mean, we've seen this as a pretext for cracking down on sending National Guard to L.A. and so on. What concerns you when you hear him talking about Antifa and going after them as being domestic terrorists? Again, them, leftists, basically, the left. And I think he's talking about Democrats, really, when he says that.
Well, I think Stephen Miller and the vice president are talking specifically about them being Democrats. First of all, let's be clear. There is no law in the United States against domestic terrorists. We don't have one. And we should take some assurance from that, because once somebody under the law is declared a terrorist, law enforcement has many more avenues to investigate and prosecute those individuals and people who provide support to them, people who help them with their financing and the like. Well, we don't have that law per se. But I think the president is a great communicator to his followers, and he's, I think, subtly sending the message that these folks who don't support me don't support you either. And not only do they not support me and they don't support you, but they're fomenting violence. And therefore, we're going to take actions that no president has taken before.
Yeah. Do you think that Democrats, I'm coming back to what you were saying earlier about the deporter in chief, Kamala Harris got in trouble, so to speak, or she took flack when she was just vice president before she was running, for saying that crossing the border is not it's not a felony, right? It's illegally crossing.
It's a misdemeanor.
It's a misdemeanor. Have Democrats, do you think, taken that too lightly? The whole idea of people being in the country illegally, to the detriment, just talking about the politics of it now.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons I was appointed as Secretary of Homeland Security by President Obama was because I had not taken that kind of an approach as a governor. I'd called the National Guard out to the Arizona border. I was the first governor to do that, because 60% of the illegal entrants into the United States were coming into the United States through Arizona. And it was causing a lot of disruption, a lot of other problems in the state. And the federal government had not put enough Border Patrol agents along the Arizona border. So we sent in the National Guard. But what they were limited to doing was doing backup paperwork, transportation of people from facility to facility, those sorts of things. They were not involved in actually patrolling the border or affecting any arrests or detentions. And we were very clear about that. They were to free up Border Patrol time. But I think the Democrats need to be smart about this. And they need to say, look, strong borders are part of being a strong country, and we are going to have strong borders. We need to have better ways for people to be able to come in legally and lawfully, because we need these people, and they contribute a lot. And then we need to deal and figure out what to do with those who are already in our country, who are going to be allowed to stay, and under what circumstances, and who must be deported.
Yeah. We're going to take some audience questions, and here's one on immigration. In shaping immigration policy and border security, how do you balance the enforcement of strong border control with the protection of civil liberties?
Well, it's not a balance to be struck. You need to do both. The law does give, at the border, does give law enforcement greater discretion to search telephones, for example, right at the border. And the border is commonly construed as the physical border into the country by like 100, 120 miles. And the courts have upheld that. I think the larger civil liberties question where immigration is concerned is not about the border, but it's what is being used as the reason for picking people who are in the interior of the country as students, as
Gardeners.
whatever, targeting them for deportation based on what they have written or said.
Yeah. Well, or even worse, just, what they look like.
Pardon me?
Or even worse, like what they look like. And, the Supreme Court seems to be okay with that kind of profiling. I mean, the story...
I got to tell you. So we're back on the Supreme Court. So
you were itching to get back there, right?
Yeah, so the court, so there's a challenge to what the Border Patrol and ICE are doing in Los Angeles based on the fact that they're picking people up in part because of the color of their skin. Their racial profiling. And the court had a hearing, took evidence, heard from the witnesses, et cetera. And the lower court said, that's right, you can't do these kind of random raids, just go around and pick people up off of the street because of racial profiling and other reasons. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reverses in another one of these, summary orders. But Justice Kavanaugh writes a concurrence, and he basically says, well, even if they're doing that, it's not such a big deal because, all you have to do is show that you're a citizen. Ignoring the record about once people are picked up, that the burden of proof is put on them to show that they're lawfully in the country. The burden of proof is not on the government to show that they're not unlawfully in the country. And they're put, they're arrested, they're put in detention centers, they're held, they can't reach their families, they can't reach their lawyers. How are they supposed to go about doing this? I mean, just the obliviousness of the justice to the reality of what the district judge found was, to me, shocking.
Well, there is a case that some have made that that there should be more Supreme Court justices like Sandra Day O'Connor from your state of Arizona, who had experience in her case, the legislature. I don't know if people would call that real life, but beyond the law, beyond the academics and the application of the law and the idea of compromise and giving and taking, that's missing in some ways from a lot of the people who are on the court right now.
That's been the tendency of the last decades, that there is a career path to get to the Supreme Court. And it means, I think, don't write anything controversial about abortion or something that might come back to haunt you. Be appointed to a court of appeals and then hope to get nominated to the Supreme Court. So that's who we basically have on the Supreme Court. In the past, we've had, I think Sandra Day O'Connor was the last person on the court who actually had held an elected office. But before her, we'd had people like Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice, had been governor of California. Hugo Black had been a senator from Alabama. The court was filled with people who had different types of experiences. And I think it's an interesting question whether the court was better when it was more worldly in that way and had a broader context about in which to view the decisions that they're called upon to make.
I remember seeing your name on a list of potential Supreme Court nominees.
Yeah.
Was that, were you vetted? I mean, how far did that get?
Yeah. I don't look good in black, so.
Oh, you look great. Come on, you're wearing it now.
No. Yes, I was vetted.
Yeah. Would you have liked that? I mean, who wouldn't want to be on the Supreme Court, right?
Well, I didn't, it was a very personal thing, but I was very satisfied with who the president chose.
Yeah, was that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or I'm forgetting where that was even.
It was Sotomayor.
Oh, Sotomayor, yeah.
I mean, come on, you lose out to Sonia Sotomayor, you can't feel bad about that.
Yeah. All right, here's another audience question. Texas went as far as blocking DACA recipients from getting a driver's license. How does this move challenge democratic principles and set a dangerous precedent for the future of the U.S. immigration system?
Yeah, Texas is interesting because they want to do their own immigration law. And the Supreme Court has kind of given them leeway to do that. You know, historically and under legal precedent, immigration is a purely federal exercise. But Governor Abbott and the Texas legislature have really said, well, it's federal, but it's also Texas. You know, we get to do our own thing. I saw a clip just before we came on this afternoon that the administration is going to reopen DACA for new enrollees, except for in Texas. Now, I want to look and I'm going, how can that be? But I'm sure there's some, machination going on there. So we'll have to see.
Isn't that given what's going on, who would want to come forward and say they're here illegally?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole trust factor that when we started DACA, there was a trust factor. If people gave us their information, would we use it just for DACA, or would we turn it over to ICE to go after their families and so forth? And we were very firm and put in writing that no, DACA documents were to be remaining in another part of the department and they wouldn't be shared, et cetera, et cetera. I think you would be hard pressed for an individual to trust the current administration in the same way.
Yeah. Speaking of Texas, they went about and redistricted their congressional lines, and now Governor Newsom has put Prop 50 on the ballot to do the same here, and they're thinking that perhaps the Democrats can flip, between 3 and 5 seats, 3 easily. What do you think of that plan?
I'm voting yes. Look.
Do you see any downside to it?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think if I were younger, in my 20s, and Prop 50 were on the ballot, I might say, legislative redistricting is just wrong. We should have independent commissions. The people of California already voted for it. We shouldn't undercut that. But now I'm saying, you know what? We didn't want to, but you can't let Texas and other states play this game and not say we also can redistrict. And to me, it's hard to say, but maybe I sound like a kid, but they started it, and we need to finish it.
Although we won't finish it, but in Missouri, and there's a whole line of states.
Yeah.
Let's see. If Congress does nothing, what realistically can be done to stop Trump? Legally.
Well, actually, the fundamental power is held by the voters. The fundamental power in our country is held by voters. We have an election coming up in 26. It will be a very important election because there's a possibility of one of the houses of the Congress, the House, and maybe it's a small percentage, but it's still there, the Senate flipping to Democratic control. That would be a check when you would actually have a chamber of the Congress that had subpoena power, that could do oversight, that could stop some of this stuff. So that's the first part. And then, in 2028, he can't run for re-election, despite what he says. So that will be a critical time, too. But in the end, these battles will be fought in the courts, they'll be fought in the universities, and they'll be fought in the press, et cetera. But it's really the voters of this country who will decide.
Yeah. Let's see, some more questions here. I'm just going to take the one on top. Thinking about what's happened to Dreamers under this administration, if the pendulum were to swing with a subsequent administration, how will public policy need to change in order to provide assurances that any given policy will outlast 4 years? And I think you can broaden that question out to any kind of agreement. You negotiate over climate, you negotiate over nuclear power in Iran, and then it just gets blown up by the next president.
Well, I think we have to get out of the business of government by executive order. And that, to me, is we've talked about the fight against science. We've talked about the fight against free speech. We've talked about the immigration policy. We've talked about the devolution of the Department of Justice. But one of the things, what we're seeing is the accumulation of power in one man, the President of the United States. That was not the vision of the Constitution, and it was not the vision of the founders. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, there was actually a debate about whether we should even have a presidency. Remember, they had just revolted against the king, but they, for certain reasons, you have a federal government. You need a CEO. And that became the president. But this government by executive order has gotten such an accumulation of power in one man that, to me, that is one of the great underlying problems with the administration, and the failure of the checks and balances system to counter that. Yeah. And so I think, for people who want assurance, like they want DACA, whatever, permanently, they want immigration, whatever, that Congress needs to pass a law. That's what they're supposed to do. Don't leave this kind of gap that a president can just fill by signing a piece of paper.
Well, how much of that do you think, and I realize you can't look into the mind of Donald Trump, but it's a lot harder to get things through Congress. I mean, we're seeing that now with the shutdown. You need 60 votes for a lot of things in the Senate, but he hasn't really tried. I mean, there was the big, beautiful bill, so to speak, which is no small thing. But in general, it seems like he's not even trying to get smaller things through Congress.
Well, a great example of that is tariffs. There is a process by which, under the law, you go to Congress to enact tariffs, and you haven't passed tariffs. But the president didn't want to do that. That takes work, and it takes laying the groundwork and proving your case. Instead, he uses this emergency authority, which nowhere mentions the word tariffs, by the way, to have his big, what was it called, Liberation Day, tariff, and has been using tariffs as a proxy for foreign policy ever since. It will be fascinating to see what the Supreme Court does with the tariff case.
The lower court struck.
The lower courts have all said, no, he does not have that power. We'll see whether the Supreme Court agrees.
Yeah. Another audience question. Given the state of the Justice Department and the military, do you think we can have fair elections?
Well, I think, look, I don't want to say, be in the position of saying the sky is falling. But I think we have to be very cognizant and watching out for example, if the president decides that on November, whatever it is, 2026, election polls in certain cities were at risk, that therefore the National Guard ought to be sent to patrol those areas and those districts, which could have the effect of deterring voters from coming. I think we have to be watching out for that and seeing if the groundwork is actually being laid now.
And what is the remedy if it is?
Well, then again, I think the cases that are being litigated now as to whether the president is properly overriding the governors and the mayors and deploying the National Guard could have how those decisions ultimately get made could have an impact there. It's something to be paying attention to.
Yeah. Just a few more minutes left here. Another audience question. How will Trump's new domestic terrorism executive order play out in the operations of DOJ, TSA, FBI, et cetera?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, like I said, there's no domestic terrorism in the law. So what do you do with that? I almost think it's a press strategy, not a legal strategy, and certainly not a law enforcement strategy. So we'll see.
Yeah. What are you going to be looking for, as we get closer to Election Day on November 4th with Prop 50, and then, of course, the midterms? I mean, what gives you hope? You said you don't want to say the sky is falling. So what makes you think, the sun's going to come up tomorrow?
So I teach a class on security policy at Berkeley. And it's grad students and undergrads, seniors mostly. And they give me hope. They're smart, they're articulate, they're well-read, they have opinions, they're not shy about expressing them.
Is there diversity of opinion?
There is diversity of opinion. And, they don't suffer, I think, from the cynicism one accumulates over time. And they do give me hope.
Yeah. I'm just curious, what is your sense of what their attitude is about the boomers and what they're being left with by these other generations?
Well, I don't think they think very highly of the boomers, for good reason. I mean, I'm a boomer, and it's like, well, what in the world is better for them than the world we inherited? And I always think that's our challenge as responsible people, is you leave a world better off than the one that you were handed off. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and we can all point to some example. Well, this is better, and this is better, and this is better. But overall, the economy is not better for them. Buying housing, the job market.
Climate change.
Climate for sure is not better. To me, there are three fundamental long-range problems that the United States has to confront, and that our Congress seems unable to deal with. One is climate. One is nuclear and nuclear proliferation. And the third is what we'll do about AI, and how we move into this AI era. These are big, complicated problems that have effects for every single person in this country. Some direct effects, some indirect, but they are very effectual. And I think in all three of those, the generations coming after us, we're not leaving them a very good record to work on.
Yeah. Well, we could spend an hour talking about AI and NVIDIA chips being sold to China and security issues around that, but alas, we're out of time. So, yeah. Secretary Napolitano, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Scott.
And for more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Scott Shafer. Thanks so much and good evening.
Thank you.